Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. The Tenpenny Files has daily conversations meant to inform and educate, not just to entertain. I come prepared and let the discussion unfold naturally with people worth hearing on topics worth exploring. If it matters to your body, your freedom, your future, we talk about it here. Each day, I talk to authors and documentary filmmakers and independent thinkers whose work challenges mainstream messaging. We cover a wide range of topics from government, politics, to astronomy, pets, and travel, to food, farming, and fitness, to vaccines and vaccine policy. Once a week, I have conversations with pastors or authors who write about faith and biblical principles. My goal is to introduce you to topics you've never heard of before, or to topics you always wish that you had time to explore but didn't know where to begin. Let our authors and our guests show you the way through the work that they've already done to lead you to a path of deeper discussion and exploration. Join me every day, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern on the Tenpenny Files as we hear from voices who've often been ignored, silenced, or censored, but truly have something important to say. Now, before we begin today's episode, I want to encourage all of you to become a Tenpenny Prime member. Prime members receive every month exclusive content, and they also get access to our monthly Ask the Expert Masterclass, where I bring actual experts for you to discuss your problems with on our online call. To find out more, go to primembership.drtenpenny.com, primembership.drtenpenny.com to learn more, hopefully join and support our work. And one last thing, I want to say a welcome to everyone who's been following us for a while. Thank you so much for listening to us regularly. And to everybody that's new, welcome, and we're glad that you're here. So now let's get started. Today's conversation is with the person who's been the global thought leader for more than 27 years on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Jeffrey Smith is here to talk about his evergreen book, Seeds of Deception, Exposing Industry and Government Lies about the Safety of Genetically Engineered Foods You Are Eating. And I think the title says it all. Jeffrey, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files, my friend. It's good to see you again. You know, I don't know what you're doing, but you are timeless, ageless. For as many,
I was going to say the same thing about you. What do we got? What do we got?
I
You know what? I
don't,
think it's when you're doing your work,
yeah.
it's like you have special wind under your sails. It's like it's not personal anymore. It's like we're here for the planet. We're here as servants, and it just keeps us with energy and youth.
Well, I would say definitely youth. I think as long as I've known you, which has probably been close to 25 years, I think that you haven't aged a minute and you look the same. So whatever you're doing, keep doing it.
Thank you.
Speaking of 25 years, you know, I've been doing this vaccine stuff. It'll be 26 years in September. And your book, Seeds of Deception, came out more than 20 years ago. That was an industry shaker. And
Yes.
still is for people who haven't read it. It really lays the groundwork for so many things that we're talking about today. Walk us through some of the transitions that you've seen over this last 20 years. And do you think things are getting better, worse, or are they about the same?
It's an excellent question, and it's been a roller coaster in terms of looking at the bigger picture. When I started, I used to work at a GMO detection laboratory to identify which foods had GMOs and which didn't. But then I realized, so I was very much in the world debate on it, reading everything that was written in the English language about it. But no one was talking about the health dangers. And all of these nonprofits were talking about environmental issues, farmers' rights to save seeds, which was being messed up by Monsanto, the illegality of patenting life. And so they were fighting on those levels. And I was saying, we should talk about the health dangers. We need to inform consumers because they're at the top of the food chain. And when they find out that GMOs and the Roundup herbicide that are sprayed on them are linked to more than 30 diseases. At the time, I didn't know how many diseases, but now we have a lot of evidence linking specific diseases to GMOs and Roundup, and we can get into that. I said, we need to convince and convey this information to consumers, and no one picked it up. So I was forced to write a book about the health dangers. Now, because I'm not a scientist or a doctor, I had to use, of course, third-party evidence and bring in a lot of scientists and doctors. But there was the question, well, who am I to say that it's dangerous when the government says it's safe? So then I had to show that actually the FDA scientists uniformly said GMOs would be dangerous and needed to be tested, but the political appointee in charge was Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president, who allowed GMOs on the market without any safety testing or labeling. And then we discovered how Monsanto and others were rigging their research and attacking scientists who discovered problems, and we exposed all of that. And so I traveled to 43 countries, sometimes nonstop for 6 to 9 months a year, and helped build a movement based on this new messaging, and that worked. So about half of the world's population now believes that GMOs present long-term health dangers, and that has kept it contained to about 12 GMO foods. However, these days, there's a new way to create GMOs that is so cheap and easy, you can do it at home. It's called gene editing, and CRISPR is the easiest form of that. And you can buy a CRISPR lab for less than $2,000 and create especially microorganisms that have never existed on the planet before and release them. You can create genetically engineered foods and feed them to people or sell them and have no jurisdiction over you in the United States and in places around the world. So what this does is it not only presents an unprecedented threat to the food supply, but once you release a GMO into the environment, it can self-propagate, it can travel, it can become a permanent part of the gene pool. So it's unrecallable. It's prone to side effects. In fact, surprise side effects are the number one result of genetic engineering. It's accessible to everyone with less than $2,000. In fact, high school kids are being assigned CRISPR transformations in science class, and it's not regulated. So these four things, that it's prone to side effects, that it's permanent, that it's unregulated, that it's easily accessible, that is the formula for a disaster, because we could replace nature in this generation. So this is why right now it is more dangerous than any time in my 30 years looking at GMOs, but also it's an unprecedented time in human civilization, where we're now playing with a technology that can affect all living beings and all future generations. And so we need to redefine our relationship with nature to be its protector now that we have the ability to replace it. So it is an urgent, all hands on deck situation now. And what we're seeing is a disinformation campaign by the biotech industry that has convinced country after country that gene editing is predictable and safe and even natural, and it's not. So one of the things that we created at the Institute for Responsible Technology is a 6-minute animated film called 7 Reasons Why Gene Editing is Dangerous and Unpredictable. It's animated. You get a vision right into the DNA as to what actually happens, and in 6 minutes you'll know more than the regulators around the world, because they have been lied to.
They've been lied to, but are they willing to listen?
That's the interesting thing. You know, I have spoken to heads of state, ministers, parliamentarians, and some of them are available and can listen, especially when they haven't been the object of an attack by Monsanto. So, for example, Monsanto doesn't have a GMO presence in Taiwan. So when I visited Taiwan, my book there was a national bestseller, Seeds of Deception, translated into Chinese. My first press conference was with a former prime minister of the country. I ended up having meetings with their top parliamentarian and senators, and they had a hearing where they summoned their version of the USDA and FDA, and then heard what I had to say. And then after I left, soon after, they eliminated GMOs from children's meals that served at school, among other things. So when there is not an effort to disinform and insulate, when I went to Australia, they took my second book, Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods, and the activists got together and bought one and gave it to every single elected official in the country. And when I got there, 2 states were planning to legalized genetically engineered canola. And those are the only states where I couldn't meet with the ministers of agriculture because they didn't want to listen. And everything we predicted that was going to go wrong did go wrong when they made it available, and they lost their premium and they couldn't sell it, and there was cross contamination, and it was a disaster, just like we knew. But it turns out Monsanto and others had worked out to give some kind of kickback to the farmers and the farmer organizations. So all of a sudden they came on board and made a decision that was against their best interest.
I this was probably about, but maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now. I had a friend that was staying at my house for a couple of weeks and not really into whole food and natural food and all that stuff as much as what I am. And they came home one day and had a protein bar that was sitting on the kitchen counter. And I picked it up and I thought, what's in this stuff? So I was looking at the side and it says made with bioengineered ingredients. And I really hadn't heard that term before. So I started looking it up and looking at the difference between bioengineered and GMO and looking at all the GMO stuff. And what turned out to be what I started to do was to create a 1,200 word Substack on this topic, which turned into a 40-page research paper of all the stuff that I kept finding that I really need to finish and I need to put out there. But what is the difference that people people understand and know about GMOs and they're bad and they anticipate them being bad, mostly because of your work, of what you've done all of these years? What's the difference between a
Well,
GMO and a bioengineered ingredient?
bioengineered is the term that the USDA used to confuse people. You see, what happened was I was part of a nationwide effort to get GMOs labeled, and we tried in different states, and the biotech industry, with supporters from the food industry, spent over $100 million lying on television because there's no law against lying on television in a political debate. I mean, it's crazy how blatant it was. And so we were not able to get ballot initiatives, but Vermont passed it in their legislature that they were going to be labeling GMOs in the state. And what happened was the biotech industry did a full court press onto Congress to say, we can't have individual states, we have to do it nationally, and we shouldn't leave it with the FDA, we should do it to the USDA, because they had a lot more influence in the USDA. So they passed what we call the DARK Act, Denying Americans the Right to Know, and said no state can require labeling, we'll give it to the USDA. And many years later, they came out with a terrible labeling law, which, you don't have to even put a note on there. You could put a QR code. So it required people to have service and a smartphone and then go through a website to find out if this ingredient was genetically engineered. Well, that got overturned by the courts. But it turns out that they give a pass to anything that doesn't contain genetically engineered detectable DNA. So most GMOs have been refined, like, corn syrup and soybean oil and things like that. You can't find the DNA in them. So those don't have to be labeled. And anything that's a result of gene editing, which we just talked about, those don't have to be labeled. And if they have to be labeled, let's use a term that no one's heard of. So it's all a way of covering up the truth, hiding information from consumers. Now, the courts just acknowledged that another layer of this was illegal, that they had to require detection. So we'll see what they come up with next. But it's basically being dictated by the GMO makers. In fact, someone who used to be at the FDA said all the regulatory agencies have done everything that Big Ag has asked them to do or told them to do. And we know that they have their own cronies inside these regulatory agencies. Sometimes it's the secretary, the cabinet member, and oftentimes it's high level placed people, like the person who was in charge of the cancer committee of the EPA. Jess Rowland was one of Monsanto's lackeys. And when there was this evidence that glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup, was likely causing cancer, and that's a Monsanto product, he sent to his handlers a text at Monsanto saying, if I can stop this other division of the government from testing for cancer on your product, I should get a medal. And then he ran the committee that said, oh no, there's no relationship between Roundup and cancer. And an analysis of his committee showed that they basically used Monsanto's data, including things that they had ghost written and paid people to sign, whereas the World Health Organization used published peer-reviewed data and came out with the opposite conclusion that Roundup is probably a human carcinogen. And then the juries around the world have found the same, that, they've awarded billions of dollars to people who, because they see how Monsanto covered up the truth. It was very exciting to be part of those trials because we saw some of the things I hadn't been able to uncover on my own. So usually I have a pretty big encyclopedic knowledge of this stuff. But then I found out, for example, that in order to test Roundup, which is sprayed on most Roundup-ready GMOs, they took Roundup and they applied it to human cadaver skin to see if it would be absorbed, because this was required by the EPA. And it turns out it was absorbed at a rate of 10%, which was 3.3 times the allowable limit, which if they admitted, that would not have been allowed to be marketed. So they did Monsanto science, which I have been studying for a year. But this is a beautiful example, a perfect example of how Monsanto rigs the game. They took new human cadaver skin and they baked it in an oven. Then they took that baked tough skin, but it wasn't good enough. Then they froze it. Then they applied Roundup to that baked frozen human skin, and very little was absorbed, and they reported that very little bit to the EPA, never telling them that they had baked and frozen the human skin before applying it.
Jeffrey, every time I hear stories like this, from the vaccine industry and the different things that they do and don't do, I wonder, how do these people live with themselves? And when it comes to stuff like this, what do they eat that they are allowing this to go into the food supply? And how do they live with themselves? Does it come down to, is it all about money, only about money? Or is it something?
Well, it's interesting. I have some stories from the inside. I know I talked to a former Monsanto scientist, and he said that he was aware that 3 of his colleagues were testing milk from cows that were treated with Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. And they found so much IGF-1, which is cancer related, in the milk that the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic, and one actually bought his own cow. Right? So in Monsanto, they wouldn't have it. I was also told by the same scientists that the rats that were fed Monsanto's corn developed serious health issues, so they rewrote the study to hide the effects. And he told me he was concerned that the amount of corn that they fed the rats was quite a bit less than the amount of corn that's eaten in southern Africa, because it's a staple eaten 3 times a day. Now, typically Monsanto's maximum corn feed is 33% in their animal feeding studies, and the maximum amount is 90 days. Whereas the people in southern Africa can eat it 70% of their caloric intake, sometimes 90% in times of famine. So he left Monsanto and was concerned about that. I actually interviewed a veterinarian whose client was a South African farmer. And he had come to this American veterinarian saying, what can I do? And it turns out the cows were sick and had poor milk, and the pigs were sick and had really bad symptoms. And he said, don't feed them another GMO. So the farmer, because they'd seen a lot of problems with animals fed GMOs in the United States. Now it's considered normal, but for those that were around before and after GMOs were introduced, it was this huge deterioration of health. So the farmer planted non-GMO corn, because he had been planting his own GMO corn, and the farmer and the cows were eating so much of this GMO corn, and the pigs. So he planted non-GMO corn, started feeding them, and they got better. But what was happening was his farm workers were eating the same corn he was growing for the animals. So it turns out while the farm workers were eating the GMO corn, it was 100% GMO corn, not the mixture normally in the market where there's some GMO and some non-GMO. And he said there was constant fever and cold-like symptoms and inflammation and headaches. He had these medicines for people. He needed 50 workers, but he had to hire 60 because there was always 20% that were too sick. And the farmer told the veterinarian that about once or twice a month, he'd be talking to a farm worker and the eyes would start tracking in different directions, not moving in parallel. And he knew that within 1 or 2 days, they would be dead.
Oh my goodness.
And he didn't know why. But when they switched to the non GMO corn, all of the problems went away with his workers. Now, they were eating more GMO food than probably anyone in the world because of the amount of corn they're eating 3 times a day and the fact that it was 100% GMO. So they're the canaries in the coal mine. So, yes, this Monsanto scientist who was worried about the people in southern Africa was aware of the dangers just in 90 days that it was causing to rats. And I never had a chance to tell him what was actually happening on this farm in South Africa. But I've also heard one time there was this story of someone who was traveling with Monsanto as a consultant in England and they were going to be fed somewhere else. And he joked, this was early on in the late 90s, I think, or early 2000s. He joked and said, well, we may get those GMOs. And the person said, oh, no, we made sure that it doesn't. So it's remarkable. And, there is this kind of narrow-minded blinders on people where people think, well, it's not my job or someone else is handling it and I'm sure they're doing a good job. Countless times I went to regulators in other countries and I said, and they would say, we don't need to test and verify GMOs because your FDA tested them and verified them. And I said, actually, no. The FDA scientist said they should be tested. But the person in charge of policy, Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later their vice president, said no testing was necessary. Companies like Monsanto can determine if their own GMOs are safe. There's a voluntary consultation process, technically known as a meaningless exercise, where they give data summaries, not even the raw data, to the FDA. And at the end of 60, 90 days, they get a letter back saying, this is to remind you that it is your responsibility to determine your foods are safe. You've determined that they are, and we have no further questions. And then when there's even an interview with a Monsanto scientist who says it's not our responsibility to determine if GMOs are safe, it's the FDA's. So everyone's passing the buck. And when you look at the actual research studies, if someone like my old friend who's now passed, Dr. Arpad Pustai, discovered that GMOs are inherently dangerous and cause massive damage in every system he looked at, he got fired, threats of a lawsuit, silenced, and that happened over and over again. Or other people that discover problems and then Monsanto makes equal and opposite research with rigged research and obsolete detection methods and say, oh, no, it's not true. Our studies show just the opposite. So pointing this out to these other regulators, they kind of get white. They kind of realize they have been duped. They thought that it was handled. And thank goodness I was on the road. I remember one time there was a delegation visiting the United States to learn about GMOs from the State Department, this big propaganda. And I somehow convinced them to send a few my way when I was living in Iowa. And a bunch came over to learn from me. The people in the State Department did not know who I was. So one of them was like the FDA chairman of Croatia, the top person in their government department. And I brought in a Croatian version of Seeds of Deception, and I threw it on the table and said, and he goes, that's yours? You're that guy? I said, yes. And he goes, until you came to the country and that book came, none of us had any thought that GMOs might be dangerous. So this was years later. And so I got ripples, coming back to me years later that my work, and I say this for your benefit because you have no idea when you give a talk how many people hear it and whether, you come back later. I mean, one time I was speaking at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, and I had been there for 4 years in a row giving talks on GMOs and different diseases each year. So the final year, they were going to give me an award, and I brought a camera and I interviewed some doctors. and they had all been prescribing non-GMO to their patients and getting better results. So I got the video. One woman said, Dr. Emily Lindner from Chicago, she said, yeah, I give non-GMOs to all my patients now and they all get better. And I said, and I was skeptical. I said, what percentage? She says, I said all right, 98%. And I said, how many people have you put on non-GMO diets? And she goes, just a minute. And she calculated how many people she sees and how she looked up and said, about 5,000. And
Wow.
so I said, can I come to your office and interview the patients? And I did. And also another doctor's office who was prescribing non-GMO. And it was remarkable. The changes were incredible. 3 days, the Crohn's disease symptoms disappeared. 6 weeks, the irritable bowel symptoms disappeared. All these things were shifting. And at the same time, we brought the video camera to farmers who had put pigs and cows now on non-GMO and were receiving the same thing in 3 or 4 days with the same basic symptoms. And I remember talking to her in the interview at the end, and I said, where'd you learn about GMOs? She said, from you. I had no idea that these ripples occurred, So it's been a fun run influencing the society this way.
I remember reading your book back in 2003 or 2004 when it first came out. And the one example that you gave there, and we're going to tell you this, and then we're going to go to our break.
I think I know what it is. Go on.
That you had 2 fields, one with GMO corn, one with non-GMO corn, and the Canadian geese wouldn't eat the GMO thing. They had the whole field. None of them would go there. And I thought, the animals are smarter than humans. They know better, and they didn't eat them. And I've remembered that all these years because it made such an impact on me. So it's just so great to hear you talking about this. I've got some really specific questions I want to ask you right after the break about the Trump's executive order on glyphosate. Then I want to get in a little bit to the pesticide immunity bill and the stuff that we're trying to fight with that. So we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors for AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the 10 Penny Files on iHeartRadio Network daily, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can also listen anywhere in the world by going to AmericaOutloud.news and listen through their media player. If you've missed any of these great conversations, and I'm telling you, we've had some really good ones, you can find the 10 Penny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on all my platforms at dr10penny.substack.com. And I think the best way to find these interviews is to go to dr10penny.com, hover over the podcast tab. You will see a drop-down window. The first link tells you the podcasts that are coming up for that particular week. You can scroll down where it says all podcasts, and you can watch or listen to all of them there. Because there are so many great books and documentaries, and in our busy lives, there's so little time to read and watch. The show is meant to maximize your time and jumpstart your interest so you know where to go to look for more information. We've got some great messages coming up from our sponsors. Sit tight. We will be right back with more with Jeffrey Smith talking about seeds of deception, exposing the industry government lies about genetically engineered foods. We've known this for a long time, and it's time to stop. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to dr10penny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again.
This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words, many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Today's conversation is with global thought leader on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms, commonly known as GMOs, Jeffrey Smith, to talk about his evergreen book, The Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of genetically engineered food that you're eating. The title says it all. Let me tell you a little bit more about my friend, longtime friend. We were talking about that before the show. We've known each other for more than 20 years. Let me tell you a little bit more about Jeffrey Smith. Jeffrey Smith is the global thought leader on the health dangers of GMOs over the last almost 30 years. He has authored 2 bestsellers, directed 5 documentaries, delivered more than 2,000 lectures in 45 countries. He has trained thousands of speakers and organized more than 10,000 grassroots advocates to stop the poisoning of our food. Additionally, Jeffrey Smith has counseled world leaders on 6 continents. His meticulous research has been presented at medical conferences, inspiring thousands of doctors to prescribe non-GMO and organic diets. His success is measured by the fact that at least 48%, if not more by now, of the world consumers has acknowledged that GMOs are unhealthy. Jeffrey, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for your many, many years of such hard work and dedication to humanity. We are greatly indebted to you.
Thank you, my friend.
You know, what do you think? You've been sort of the leader for decades, that you were the one that first exposed all this stuff about glyphosate, all their crappy research and all their shifty scientists that have been, censored and all these different things about Roundup and the active ingredient, which is glyphosate. I had a landscape guy a few years ago that said glyphosate is a toxic watch, and he drank it. It was
Oh my
like
God.
right in front of me, and my eyes just popped out of my head, and I thought, "Whew, well, okay, you can lead horses to water, but you can't make them drink."
Oh my goodness, I've never heard that. That is horrible. Well, let me do this.
Let's ask you something.
Okay, all right, I have an idea where we may want to go with this that'll really pop the eyes of your listeners and like, whoa, go ahead.
I want to do that, but I want to get your thoughts on President Trump's executive order about making the acquisition of glyphosate a national security issue, even though I think it's China produces 80% of it or something like that. And it really, really turned off and enraged the Maha people, and who have been standing so firmly behind Bobby Kennedy of trying to make America healthy again. And then after they did that, all the work that we've been doing on stopping the pesticide immunity bill, which has been said by Catherine Austin Fitts and a couple of her researchers, that if that passes, it is going to be an extinction level event because of the negative impact on fertility. So those 2 things kind of together all circle around glyphosate. What are your thoughts about those issues?
Yeah, I am going to integrate this eye-popping information into my answer because I want to make it very personal. I want to point out that how bad glyphosate is to put into context this presidential executive order and this liability. So I want to build a case that glyphosate and GMOs, especially the GMOs that have glyphosate on them, are a national health issue and maybe one of the most negatively impactful toxins ever in modern society. I'm not talking about infectious disease, I'm talking about toxins. Now, first of all, people should know that glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup, is what is used to spray on Roundup Ready soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. Most of those, except it's not all of the alfalfa and the it's not all the alfalfa, but it's most of everything else. Most of the soy, most of the corn, most of the canola, most of the cotton is Roundup ready. All of the sugar beets. And that means it's designed not to die when sprayed with Roundup. So if you eat the GMOs, the Roundup gets absorbed into the plant, deposited in the foods portion, and it's in our food in large numbers. But that's not the only exposure. Obviously, if your neighbor's doing it, that's another exposure. But it's also used to dry down grains and beans. So it's sprayed on wheat just before harvest, 3 to 5 days before harvest. It's sprayed on oats, it's sprayed on lentils and mung beans and chickpeas. So it's in high concentrations. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, we have a database of the glyphosate levels of various raw food products as well as brands at responsibletechnology.org. Now, that means it is in the food supply. Now, to avoid it, you want to eat organic, which doesn't allow either GMOs or Roundup. But I'm going to talk about the liability shield, but I want to indicate just how dangerous this stuff is. My friend, Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who downloads massive amounts of data from the internet. She's a senior researcher at MIT, and she knows how to do big data analysis, and she also has a degree in biology. So she wanted to figure out, using data and biological mechanisms, what was causing autism. And so she pulled everything down that she could and said, I understand, because of the physiological changes, why these kids have these particular problems, but I can't figure out the toxic input. So she looked at every single toxin that she knew about, and it didn't fit. She went to a lecture by another friend of mine, Dr. Don Huber, and sat at the edge of her seat because he was talking about glyphosate, and realized that glyphosate fit hand in glove perfectly as a trigger for autism. Now, you have your own theory on it, but then the two may work together. But that was an example of, later she put a chart together of the incidence of autism in 6-year-olds, the amount of glyphosate they've been exposed to over the past 4 years, how much glyphosate has been sprayed on soy and corn, and it was nearly a perfect correlation, 0.9978 out of 1. And it demonstrated high correlation, but she had also the biological mechanisms of how glyphosate could change the physiology to create that. Now, I'm going to just review some of the other diseases. For those that are watching, and there's going to be both watching and audio, I'm just going to flip through some charts, and I'm just going to describe them. So if you're not watching, it's okay. These charts describe how correlated different diseases are to glyphosate. And they're very highly correlated. As the disease goes up, as the disease goes up, so too does the amount of glyphosate. So we have inflammatory bowel disease, death from obesity, anxiety, diabetes, deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from Parkinson's, deaths from hypertension, autism in 6-year-olds, which was, as I say, nearly a perfect correlation, insomnia, celiac disease, acute kidney injury, death from kidney failure, kidney and renal pelvic cancer, liver cancer, liver and bile duct cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths from leukemia, breast cancer, deaths from intestinal infection, deaths from disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, peritonitis, hepatitis C, dementia, deaths from senile dementia, diagnosis of ADHD, schizophrenia, suicide by overdose, tons of birth defects. I'm flipping through all these types of birth defects, including blood disorders. And then there's anemia and deaths due to stroke. Now, in addition to these charts, I sent out a survey to 3,256 people who reported getting better from 28 different conditions when they switched to largely non-GMO diets. And the number one improvement was digestive disorders, with 85.2% reporting improvements. And most of those that reported improvements, 80% of them was either significant improvements, almost gone, or completely resolved. 60% got better from fatigue, 54.6% from overweight or obesity, about 52% from brain fog, also from anxiety and depression, over 50% food allergies and sensitivities, and it goes down to all these different diseases. I don't need to mention them all now. But the idea is this is a national emergency. So put that against Trump's executive order saying protecting the availability of glyphosate is a national emergency. They were told by Bayer, that bought Monsanto, that if they don't get protection from liability of people suing them for cancer, that they're going to stop making glyphosate available, and that will destroy the soy and corn and cotton and canola and sugar beet crops that rely on them. So instead of creating a logical transition from this dangerous toxic input with 300 million pounds a year sprayed on America to a non-toxic based agriculture, Trump folded and said, okay, we need to declare this a national emergency. Now, it's unclear to me whether the executive order grants the liability, but it's being used in the Supreme Court case where Bayer has asked the Supreme Court to say, if the EPA approves it, no one can sue. If the EPA doesn't require a label, no state can require a label. The liability law built into the farm law and others also, no one can sue if it's passed by the EPA. It's protecting against their liability. Now, we already mentioned earlier that that Monsanto lied to the EPA. They had their lapdog in the EPA. And there's many other ways that in these court cases it was found out that they ignored experts that showed them that their glyphosate was probably causing cancer, and fired the expert and then ghost wrote exactly the opposite in a review study, and then paid people to sign it and sent that to the EPA. So they defrauded the EPA, they defrauded this science community, they defrauded consumers, and now we're not allowed to sue if this passes because the EPA says it's okay based on false and fraudulent data. So the whole thing is an absolute disaster. So I know I've met Bobby Kennedy on the road around these trials. He was one of the attorneys for the first Monsanto Roundup case, protecting Lee Johnson, representing Lee Johnson, who was a groundskeeper for the Benicia School District in California, who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from using Roundup. And he won and was awarded, $250 million, although the judge lowered it. And so Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr. knows about the dangers of this stuff. We talked about it on his podcast. And he's not in charge of this. The USDA secretary is in charge of this. And the EPA is in charge of this. And that has allowed this disaster to continue. And then the way that it was supported in the executive order just reinforces what we've been watching for more than 2 decades, that the government has done everything that Big Ag has asked them to do and told them to do. Even the State Department was turned into an enforcement wing by Monsanto, where if you look at the cables made available from WikiLeaks, they met with Monsanto's representatives. They told governments to accept GMOs and Roundup all over the world. So it's USAID. They were a enforcement wing. They were sending GMO soy and corn to places that had famine rather than giving them money. And I remember I was in Zambia. They had said, we're not allowed to take GMOs. It's against our laws. And the US said, tough, take it or starve, right? Yeah. And they said, we'll find it somewhere else. This infuriated the American government because it blew their pretend scheme that GMOs were there to feed the world. So they started to nail Zambia. They sent over Congress people and senators, and I was talking to one of the ministers, and he introduced himself to the Secretary of Agriculture, Ann Veneman, as from Zambia, and she goes, "Backward country," and turned and walked away. They were being completely marginalized and attacked. So when I wrote a full article interview for an investigative reporting magazine in South Africa called Nose Week, I love the name. I got contacted by the government newspaper in Zambia saying, "Can we place that? Can we use it?" They did a full spread inside their paper with a picture of the president with my talk about GMOs and the dangers because it vindicated them. And then when I was there, I spoke to their House of Chiefs. They have a Senate and a Congress and a House of Chiefs. And first thing I did was I said, "I'm from the United States and I apologize. They have treated you so badly. You were right to say no to GMOs. No one died from starvation. They got their food from someone else." But can you imagine? We already talked about what happened in South Africa, where people eating it. Now you have immune compromised people who are sick, and you feed them GMOs, and it's a disaster. So, yeah, so the government has been basically an enforcement wing of Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer. And this is just the latest in what is a travesty.
Wow. Well, that was very important information that everybody needed to hear. I want to shift gears just a little bit, but for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to keep it a little bit shorter. We've only got, about 5 or 6 minutes left.
All right.
Another couple of hours, but recently you were part of a research team that published a paper titled "Genetically Modified Microorganisms: Risk and Regulatory Considerations for Human and Environmental Health." What are genetically modified microorganisms, and why should we be concerned, in just a couple of minutes?
All right. Microbes, our microbiome inside us can determine whether we're healthy or sick. The bacteria, algae, fungus, viruses, archaea, all of them are part of the microbiome. Microbiome is essential for human health. You know that. Many of your readers or listeners know that. Microbiome is essential for environmental health. The algae produces most of the Earth's oxygen. The mycorrhizal fungi shuttle nutrients between trees. Soil microbes conduct the carbon cycling. When you genetically engineer a microbe, you introduce a new genetic combination that may never have existed before. You release that into the environment. Microbes swap genes. So if you've given them some kind of survival advantage, that new gene or gene combination can be passed on around the world, changing the nature of nature, that it would be irrecallable and can change the way the microbes inside us and around us support life. It could cause disease, it could cause damage or collapsing ecosystems, and right now there's a massive amount of genetically engineered microorganisms that are being put on farmlands and being created by high school and college students. So this is an absolute existential threat. And one of the most important things that I can do is to try and get this and other governments to say, we cannot allow genetically engineered microbes to be released into the environment, or we may destroy life.
Wow. So are you making any headway with that? Are we getting these people to stop?
Well, publishing this.
Before you answer that, why are they doing this in the first place?
Well, it was interesting. I talked to a microbiologist who works with microbes, and at the beginning of our hour-long conversation, he said, "I have no problem with releasing GMOs in the environment, GMO microbes." And at the end of the hour, this person who was very senior said, "You've completely convinced me. I don't think any genetically engineered microbes should be released ever." We had a microbiologist on staff. I said, "Check with your colleagues what their concern about GMO microbes are." He contacted 5 of them, and they said all the same thing. Never really thought about it. It's not like they think of the disasters and say, let's go. They just don't think about it because everyone is moving forward. There's 2 companies that have already created genetically engineered microbes as soil inoculants, and it's on as much as 45 million acres with as many as 5 trillion microbes per acre. There's also genetically engineered microbes being used in factories where, let's say, you want to create an opioid. You take an opium gene from the opium poppy, put it into yeast or bacteria or algae, and then it produces the opium, and then you isolate it, purify it. You have a cheap way of producing opium or CBDs or industrial enzymes or vanilla or whatever. Now you have these organisms in your factory that if they get out, now they're producing these things in the environment. If they get into the human gut microbiome, you may have opium or CBDs or these things being produced inside you 24/7. And think about even in the most secure laboratories, anthrax gets out, flu viruses get out. What about these factories where there's hundreds of them producing these called synthetic biology or synbio? Is it possible that they're going to escape from these factories? Of course. So it's like a ticking time bomb.
Well, Jeffrey, we could talk about this for another hours. I've taken lots of notes here, and I'm going to listen to this interview again because this is so terribly important. In the last minute or two that we have here, what's your takeaway for people, and where can they get your books and your documentaries and all of the things that you?
Sure. So I'm going to give three things. First of all, biotech industry has been trying to attack me for years. They haven't been successful until recently. They hacked our Facebook account, and we lost 125,000 people who lost the account. So please go to the Institute for Responsible Technology Facebook page and join the page and join the group so that we can tell them you're not going to get away with it. Let's rebuild it together. You can go to responsibletechnology.org, which is the mothership of information, sign up for the newsletter, and watch the film. Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, 16 minutes on the dangers of genetically engineered microbes, and one that was 2 weeks away from being released that could have, according to one scientist, ended terrestrial plant life on the planet. Fortunately, we didn't find out because it wasn't released. And you can watch the 6-minute film about the dangers of genetically engineered gene editing and a lot of other things. And so if you want the book is the Seeds of Deception is old, but it's, as I say, as you said, evergreen, because it's about how this stuff was introduced. And that's bedrock in terms of based on lies and whatnot. And that's at seedsofdeception.com. So I have also the best documentary that I created with Amy Hart is called Secret Ingredients, and that's at secretingredientsfilm.com. The reason why it's the best is because people switched to organics and got better. Kids who are on the spectrum, no longer on the spectrum. People that couldn't get pregnant, got pregnant. One woman has 100% success rate at her clinic for having infertile couples have kids, and the main thing is she puts them on organic food, talking about fertility.
We're going to have all these links in the show note below. So, Jeffrey, thank you so much for your decades of hard work. Thank you for being my friend all these years. And thank you for what's coming in the future, too, that we'll leave that as a little tagline. But thank you so much for this great interview and this great conversation. We're out of time for today, everyone. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. We will see you tomorrow or the next time right here on the 10 Penny Files at AmericaOutloud.news, iHeartRadio, or any of the podcast platforms that we talked about. Have a great day, rest of your day, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.